to this next to last of our colloquium. Our speaker today is Professor Nicolas Terry, who comes from the Indianapolis University Robert H. McKinney School of Law, where he is the Hall Render Professor of Law and Director of the Hall Center for, as you can see it here, Law and Health. He received his education from Kingston University and the University of Cambridge in the UK, and he is one of the most wonderfully interesting people writing in the US, and in fact, I think it's fair to say in the world today, on questions of privacy, technology, and health, and artificial intelligence, which he's going to talk with us about today. And if you've just been reading the news, think about your eyes and Google. Okay?
Hey, that might even be a slide, Leslie. Well, thank you so much. We won't discuss exactly how long ago we met, but we are old friends, and it's always a treat to be back out here. So this is something I've been thinking about, the AI tsunami. The use of that phrase is actually, I give credit to Naveen Jain, who is the founder of a tech firm called Biomedicine, who talks about this tsunami. And you've probably seen headlines like that about AI medicine and so on. Periodically, we run through these cycles. While you were all still in college, or probably not actually in high school, Professor Francis and I went through the Dr. Google and Dr. Microsoft stage, if you remember that, when they were going to take over health law. So maybe this is just one of those cycles and we'll move on. My basic argument this afternoon is I don't think so this time. Some people, for example, an Accenture piece on AI and healthcare, quote, "At hyperspeed, AI is rewriting our modern conception of healthcare delivery." Like we have a modern conception of healthcare delivery. Sorry. AI in health represents a collection of multiple technologies enabling machines to sense, comprehend, act, and learn so they can perform administrative and clinical healthcare functions. Unlike legacy technologies, that's what snobby tech people call the real world, unlike legacy technologies that are only algorithms, tools that complement a human, health AI today can truly augment human activity, taking over tasks that range from medical imaging to risk analysis to diagnosing health conditions. So I thought I'd try and unpack that statement, dripping as it is with hubris, and sort of run you through the following outline. Give you a little background on how we move from data collection and clinical data, which is what Professor Francis and I started writing about some time ago now, moving into data analytics and then into AI and machine learning. Talk more about AI ML and the hubris surrounding that. And then, because this is law, in a law school for CLE, we're going to talk about some of our current regulatory models, and then we'll sort of end by sort of peering a little bit into the future, maybe what kind of regulatory model are we going to see for data technologies and so on. We could, but we're not going to, spend probably an hour just analyzing the various data pools, medically inflected data, social media, transactional exhaust data, apps and wearables, the Internet of Things dripping with their social determinants data. We could talk about all of these sources of data, but I'm going to assume that you are familiar with that and you get the idea that these data are the fuels that are going to be powering healthcare data analytics, healthcare robots, and feeding AI and machine learning. It's that role of data as fuel that gives rise to silly phrases that tech people spout out occasionally, such as data is the new oil or data is the new coal. And aren't we happy about how the new coal is working out? Indeed, there's an entire but somewhat unedifying literature suggesting metaphors for the size and scope of data collection. I've given up, as you can see, and I now just simply endorse the idea that data is the new bacon. Data are renewable. Paul Sondriger of Oracle said, data will be the ultimate externality. We will generate them whatever we do. As Victor Meyer-Schonberger and Kenneth Kokia put it, the key is that data analytics systems perform well because they are fed with lots of data on which to base their predictions. Moreover, the systems are built to improve themselves over time by keeping a tab on what are the best signals and patterns to look for as more data is fed in. Now, not all data technologies present in the same way. So, for example, just take healthcare analytics. The trick is that even within one healthcare entity, think down the street to your own medical campus. There are all sorts of different data and all sorts of different analytical tasks being performed. Clinical point of care, research into clinical operations, regulatory operations, people looking at research outcomes, intramural or corporate research, public health research, population health research. And the reason why I represent it like this, not only because I think that is a relatively accurate sort of ascendant look, but also if you think about each of those tasks, with some overlaps, each is probably going to attract a slightly different regulatory model. So even within one type of data, within one type of entity, we're going to have tremendous variety and tremendous differentiation between legal models. Just 6 months after El Camino Hospital in Silicon Valley bought their AI, the rate at which patients suffered dangerous falls dropped 39%. They built a predictive algorithm that looked at health records, risk factors, merged the data, did some real-time tracking, and figured out which patients were likely to be the next ones to fall. Every time a patient pushes a call light or hits a bathroom or bed alarm, it's recorded. And then the software takes that and compares it to other events and predicts likely falls and so on. Many, many more uses that are only just now beginning to come online. Private healthcare entities are using big data to protect life expectancy, genetic predisposition to disease, and that's a big one there. Like me, you're probably still waiting for a flying car. Well, your generation's flying car is going to be precision medicine, right? It's going to be really cool when it gets here, but I won't be around, right? In the meantime, data-fueled pharmacovigilance and drug modeling is probably going to give us far more personalized or precision medicine. What else? Big data techniques are being used to reduce out-of-network referrals by some healthcare entities. Others tackle readmissions by analyzing patient-specific data from admission, discharge, follow-up calls, post-discharge patient interactions, as well as other clinical data. We know that healthcare regulatory agencies are already significant users of data analytics. CMS runs a prepayment predictive analytics program called the Fraud Prevention System against Medicare fee-for-service claims. Various techniques are used to discover fraud, including pattern tracking, anomaly detection, link analysis. The VA has its ReachVet program, which is a database program designed to predict suicide amongst veterans and push intervention. The Food and Drug Administration has several major projects leveraging big data. For example, Janus combines historical clinical trial data with post-marketing studies and surveillance-based, and so on and so forth. Let's touch briefly on some of the technology. Moore's Law, some of you may have heard of. It's a law that has dominated discussions relating to the development of computer-based technologies. In very simple terms, Moore's Law says that computing would dramatically increase in power and decrease in relative cost at an exponential pace. Think how much faster your iPhone has got in just 10 years. Well, you probably didn't have one when they came out. I did, and it was awful. Moore's Law not only helps explain the past few decades of increases in automation, but is viewed by many futurists as predictive. Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McKee says, quote, "We're at an inflection point, a point where the curve starts to bend a lot because of computers. We are entering a second machine age, if you like, the tipping point." The December 2017 Janus report on artificial intelligence for health and healthcare noted, quote, "Unlike previous eras of excitement over AI, the potential of AI applications in health may make this era different because of the confluence of the following three forces. 1, frustration with our legacy medical system. 2, ubiquity of network smart devices in our society. 3, acclimation to convenience and at-home services like those provided by Amazon." Now, it could be that our new AI-powered robot overlords will simply stage a coup and take over. But it's possible we will actually have the opportunity to make some choices as to the extent we want our medicine to be AI-fueled. We've made these choices throughout our history. Historically, humans have entered into symbiotic, intimate relationships with those with more, or at least more perceived knowledge or expertise. And many of those we've allowed to monitor our physical and mental states in the hope that their generalized knowledge can be personalized to improve or sustain our conditions. At various points in our history, we've made these arrangements with healers, shamans, priests, medicine men, mystics, quacks, sellers of snake oil, doctors, and most recently, healthcare institutions such as hospitals and insurers. Are we going to make the same deal with AI at some point? We view the relationships with our modern professionals, particularly our healthcare professionals, in a particular way that we express as a professional relationship, this magical thing. A very cool book, Susskind and Susskind, in 2017, The Future of the Professions, says that the idea behind the professional relationship is that it's a product of a grand bargain or a social contract. In exchange for their knowledge, their commitment to continuing education, and ethical approaches, we grant them exclusivity in the market and self-regulation. I'm actually a little more skeptical, cynically. I think we have allowed our relationships with professionals and given them that special status because they're of just a pragmatic response to the fact that of the human condition, that as humans we only have a certain amount of data storage and only a certain amount of data processing power. As a result, what we did was, knowing that we couldn't do it all, we picked individuals and said, you get highly educated in this, you get highly educated in that, you get highly educated in this, and so on. And if I'm right, that breaks down when we have machines that don't have data storage and data processing limitations. Which I think is a good way to get into AI and some of the hubris. So this is one of the sort of the classic AI curves that's out there, or analytics curves. Gartner, IBM, others have tried to model the maturity, or if you like, the trajectory of data analytics and the machines that are powered by it. Initially, it's kind of like how you progress through law school, if you think about it, except for the last bit, right? Initially, you have these systems that are essentially descriptive, right? They tell you what happened. Then you get slightly diagnostic. Why did it happen? Remember those first Socratic questions? Then you get some predictive. What will happen? And then the question is whether we will ever allow it, the machines and the data, to take us to the top of the trajectory. When it's prescriptive and the machines are making the decisions for us, and then other machines are checking those and making even more, stronger predictions. Now, you probably all heard of IBM's Watson, the great cancer-cracking, Jeopardy-cracking smart computer. But the word is that it's not going awfully well. There was an extremely ugly divorce from the MD Anderson Cancer Center, with internal audits saying it was a horrible waste of money and nothing was happening. Only a few dozen hospitals apparently have adopted the system. The foreign hospitals hate it, apparently, because it's horribly American biased. It doesn't seem as yet to be a fully developed system and was probably deployed too early. IBM is not very transparent about it. Apparently there aren't too many papers explaining the technology and so on. It's all very proprietary. There are other issues with AI and limitations. Have any of you experimented with the Google Arts and Culture app? What you do is you take a selfie and the app then matches you to a famous artwork. So the good news is it was powerful enough to figure out that I'm balding, aging, and overweight. The only light in this particular tunnel is that I am hanging in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which is one of my very favorite places to go. The other sort of limitation that we've seen with regard to AI, for example, who knew that it's so difficult to distinguish labradoodles from fried chicken? But we'll fix those things, right? It's going to get better and better. Primarily because of machine learning. Bernard Marr noted, given the power of computing delivered by Moore's law and the almost limitless amount of data available on the internet, engineers realized that rather than teaching computers and machines how to do everything, it would be far more efficient to code them to think like human beings and then plug them into the internet to give them access to all of the information in the world. And that's really what it's about. And we're seeing the beginnings of it. All right, we're seeing papers out there showing that machine learning systems can begin to predict whole brain seizures. We're beginning to see some cancer technologies that AI, ML can pick up. A paper last year on CDI, which is Clostridium difficile, which is a very nasty bacterium spread by physical contact with objects or infected people, and it thrives in hospitals. And the other reasons you should never go there, other than you probably don't have health insurance because it's too expensive. Anyway, we get about 400, almost 500,000 cases a year of this, and roughly 30,000 deaths in the US. Traditional methods such as hygiene monitoring and so on doesn't seem to be working, but we now seem to have some evidence that a data-driven model can actually predict and significantly lower the amount. I don't think we're going to get sort of a flat, a regular adoption kind of model here. I think there are parts of healthcare that are going to be swamped by AI long before others. I particularly think that diagnostics is going to be the main use of AI, at least in my lifetime. These dry brains are beginning to work a lot faster and better than wet brains. The master algorithms that people like Pedro Domingos talks about, which have such incredible power. Recently, Google researchers reported they'd made progress in solving what's called the catastrophic forgetting problem in neural networks, such that AI remembers what it did before and can build on top of it. And the other reason I point to diagnostics, other than I think there's a good mapping, is that I think it is such a horrible nut that we have failed to crack. You have probably studied in your health law classes never events, you know, the objects left after surgery, wrong site surgery, falls, bed sores, and so on. We have a diagnostic error epidemic in this country. The IOM has reported on it, and it's remarkable how little progress we've made. So it wouldn't surprise me to see that there. And as Leslie was chatting just before I started talking, just this week we got a paper in Nature Biomedical Engineering from a team working at the University of Adelaide in Australia, in which Google's medical spin-off company, Verily, V-E-R-I-L-Y, announced a breakthrough in cardiovascular risk analysis. They trained the algorithm. That's the kind of picture you have to start getting. You have training algorithms with a data set of nearly 300,000 patients. This information included eye scans as well as general medical data. And then neural networks we use to mine this information for patterns. And it looks like cardiovascular risk factors can now be mined from retinal pictures. So let's talk regulation. Maybe it's all peachy and everything's going to be great. But if it isn't, and particularly at the beginning, as the robots start taking over our lives, we're probably going to have to try and figure out some of the regulatory issues. Let's start with data protection and a quick primer, though I think it's rather stupid of me to suggest that any of Professor Francis's students need a privacy primer. But anyway, this is how I think of privacy, or how I think of data protection. There are two axes, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. The vertical axis denotes types of protective models, in particular whether these are upstream models, protective models, or downstream models. So an upstream model would be a model that, for example, regulated the amount of data that could be collected. So it's a collection-centric position. Whereas downstream models tend to be disclosure-centric. All right. So, for example, if you say that you can only, if you say that companies like Amazon can only collect the data that they need for that transaction, and then they have to get rid of that data after the transaction takes place, we have put in an upstream data collection kind of model. On the other hand, and in the US, we tend to favor, when we have any data protection we're talking about, we tend to favor downstream models. So in healthcare in particular, we use three downstream models. Healthcare privacy, under the privacy rule, which, as you all know, is not a privacy rule, it's a confidentiality rule. It's a disclosure rule, saying you shall not disclose this confidential information, security, and for those times when the horse has already left the barn, data breach notification. The horizontal axis is descriptive of which commercial domains, or which domains, don't even have to be commercial, these protective models apply to. So, for example, do they apply to all types of commerce, including health? Or do they only apply to healthcare and not, for example, and does a different system apply, for example, to financial data or consumer data? So it's a horizontal question. With this model, we can do a comparison of our data protection system with Europe's, for example. So if you look at the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which I'm guessing most of you have studied or heard about, or at least seen panicked newspaper reports about Microsoft executives moving things to Ireland. Generally, the GDPR fills almost all of my diagram. It has multiple upstream and downstream protective models, and it applies pretty much across all domains. Compare the US. The FTC has pretty broad cross-domain applicability under the Federal Trade Commission Act. It can apply to pretty much all domains, but it is restricted to some quite narrow downstream type protective models. There's HIPAA. Right? HIPAA has relatively broad, albeit downstream protective models, but it only applies to a subset of healthcare, what we would call legacy healthcare, the covered entity issue. And then if you zoom in and you look at that little space of healthcare in the US where there is regulation, you can see that it's really noisy as well. Because as well as HIPAA, we've got intersecting problems from 42 CFR Part 2, which is the substance use regulations. We've got GINA, we've got the ADA, we've got the common rule that's now finally escaping. And this is a very messy, noisy issue. Zoom back out again and look at what happens when you have healthcare regulated in a very small space, or healthcare data protection in a very regular space. If I don't feel, if I'm a disruptive company, if I'm making apps, medical apps, if I'm making phones, if I'm making smartwatches, I'm probably not going to be in HIPAA space. If I'm building Internet of Things, collecting social determinants of health, I'm probably not going to be a covered entity. I'm not going to be covered by HIPAA. So you have this massive area of healthcare business and medical business and wellness business that is not covered by poor little old HIPAA. And some companies know this really well and practice what we call regulatory arbitrage, where they will deliberately stay away from HIPAA data and essentially build replicas of that data from data they can acquire outside the HIPAA-covered space. Next, an already previewed consumer protection laws. So, that was good. Let's try that again. Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act has two basic rules in it. There's an unfair prong and a deceptive prong. So the unfair prong, for example, enabled the FTC to successfully go after the Wyndham Hotels Group and get a settlement from them that they really did fight hard against for a long time until we had a circuit court opinion that essentially when there were multiple security breaches and they didn't really fix anything, that was deemed by FTC to be unfair, And the court said the FTC has got power to regulate that under the unfair prong. The deceptive prong, as you would imagine from deceptive, is like, okay, the medical app, right, that puts out a privacy policy. We will not sell your health information that we collect through this app to advertisers. But of course they do. Well, that's deceptive, and so the FTC will go after them for that. The FTC is also, just for the completeness, just in case there is a test, the FTC also does have some specific jurisdiction. So it has been able to go after some credit brokers under the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act. The FTC also is responsible for sort of commercial space applications of the ADA, Fair Housing Act, and GINA. And so we've seen a few actions like that. Let's start thinking about regulatory models as devices. That's the first thing you have to get your head around here. Are we talking about device law? Yes, we are. These AI machines, these robots, are likely to be classified, and the apps the health apps you have on your phones are generally thought of as devices and would be regulated by the FDA. Section 201H of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a very broad definition of device. If you've studied this topic, you know that medical devices are split into three categories. An awful lot of the stuff we're talking about, like little apps and so on, probably would just come under 501Ks, so it's not a huge regulatory burden. But nevertheless, the manufacturers of these kinds of products are keen to keep as much of them out of the sticky hands of the FDA as they can. So, for example, IBM apparently has been lobbying hard to keep the FDA away from Watson. We have the end of 2017, one of President Obama's last acts was to sign the 21st Century Cures Act. I hope one of your professors never asks you to read it. It is absolutely ghastly, horrible piece of legislation, congressional hubris at its worst, thousands and thousands, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and it does almost nothing. But they had Cures Act in it, so everyone thought it was great. So a tendency here in the Cures Act to deregulate. So there's specific sort of statutory language now that your Fitbit is not a medical device, that many of your wellness apps are not medical devices. Electronic health records are not medical devices. The other kinds of software used in doctors' offices, not medical devices. We didn't think any of them really were medical devices before, but the Cures Act kind of made it clear. The one thing that has always been problematic, and the precedent for thinking about how AI would be regulated, are what are called clinical decision systems in hospitals. Have you ever heard of those? These are the smart systems that read read the clinical data that's in the cloud, look at what the doctor's prescribing, and send the doctor an alert if there seems to be a mismatch between the chosen prescription and the condition of the patient, including, for example, a contraindication because of a drug mismatch or something like that. CDS is a big business. They're the smarts that are now incorporated into electronic health records. And the language that 21st Century Cures has, saying they're not devices, but that sometimes they may be devices, is almost impossible to pass. It really hasn't helped an awful lot. There are refreshed guidances from the FDA on medical apps and so on, but not really moving much forward from what we already know. This is interesting. This is Scott Gottlieb, the new FDA Commissioner's Digital Innovation Plan. And what it is, it's a pre-cert program. All right. So how do we regulate devices at the moment? If I'm Apple, I'm building a watch, and it's got a blood flow sensor in it that, with software, can be used to predict heart attacks. All right. That's a medical device. So it would have to go through some system at the FDA. Would it be probably a 501(k), comparing the watch maybe to some other existing hospital-based systems that do something like that? Well, the Digital Health Innovation Plan turns that on its head. Instead, it says, instead of regulating the device, we're going to sort of regulate the device manufacturer. We're going to bless certain manufacturers, and there's a pilot program. IBM, Google, Apple, Samsung, you can complete the list. I think there are 9 of them. And there's a pilot program, so we're going to if they can prove they have good processes, and what they do generally doesn't lead to a dangerous product, then we're going to pre-certify them. Those products can go on the market without going through FDA device regulation, and then we'll do post-sale surveillance. And they have to set that up as well. Is this the sort of thing? Now, why do we do that? Well, because software companies, device companies, consumer electronics companies iterate products far faster than the FDA can process regulation of them. So it fits into that regulation is stopping innovation meme that is so popular on the Hill. Is this the kind of model that we're going to see for AI, home care robots, and things like that going forward? Are we going to move into a pre-cert kind of model? If we do, what kind of products are we going to see? Well, this is actually an FDA-approved. How many of you have an Apple Watch? Anyone have an Apple Watch? Right. If you have an Apple Watch, you know that you can put lots and lots. You spend all of your money. You think the watch was expensive in the first place, let alone the data plan on mine. But you can buy lots and lots and lots more wonderful straps that you put on. Well, this one is actually a band that has a built-in EKG monitor. And this went through 510(k) regulation. This went through regular device regulation. If I had to bet the next Apple Watch, so 4, or 2 is it, 3, the new Apple Watch that will come out later this year, you can pretty much guarantee that that EKG is not going to need a strap. It will be built into the watch, along with the blood flow monitor. How many of you have iPhones? I assume you are, if you are up to date, you're running 11.26 if you've got the latest data patch. In March of this year, 11.3 will come out, and 11.3 contains a health records app. And it's a health records app that complies with, what is it? Leslie, HL7? The data format, the data transfer thing, the standard. And so pretty much any hospital or any doctor's office will have data through an API that can be fed straight into your Apple Watch. So you will become soon your own curator of all of your health records in one place on a device that doesn't have HIPAA protection. So good luck with that. What else? How else could we sort of regulate? Well, what about soft law, private ordering? Market power, when it's used well, can function as a powerful type of private governance or soft law. But information company, data broker, consumer reporting agencies, self-regulatory codes of conduct have been generally derided as being insulting with how little protection they give people. There have been attempts to make hybrid models whereby you have codes of conduct but you try and make them binding through law. That was in the Obama White House Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights Act in 2015. And that was a classic piece of proposed legislation which got killed from both sides because it was way too prescriptive for industry and completely insufficient for privacy advocates. And so there was a tree fell in the forest. So occasionally you'll find someone with real market power like Apple. I own no shares, by the way. Well, I suppose my mutual funds might. So they actually probably provide more data protection than any legal system in this country at the moment. Because if you don't follow these rules when you're using health apps, at least the health APIs in iOS, then you get thrown out of the Apple Store. So you cannot use data that you pull off the Apple Watch if you're a developer for marketing purposes or any of the other things that we talk about. So what about our regulatory future? Well, first, what might have been. While it was never articulated as a priority by candidate Clinton, I think if the election had gone the other way, it would have been 10 years since the HITECH Act. We probably would have seen a bit of tweaking, 8 years from the HITECH Act. Secondly, I think the FCC and FTC would have been kept as was and would have been encouraged to do more in the way of protection of consumer privacy and security. And I think the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, would have sort of asserted itself, particularly in the financial domains, killing arbitration clauses and generally doing sort of computer protection. Well, don't hold your breath that any of that's happening, right? The new CFPB head, Mick Mulvaney, has killed the Equifax probe into a 143 million person data breach. So that's gone, and we're not going to see any more of that. We will have a few hangovers, so like there is some data regulation left over in the 21st Century Cures Act. It's kind of nerdy inside baseball kind of stuff, so there's stuff on a trusted exchange framework for clinical data. There are rules about making data interoperable and not doing information blocking, which apparently is a terrible thing that apparently is ruining healthcare, but no one can actually find anyone who's doing it. But we legislated against it because it's evil and it must be stopped. All of those need rules, by the way, so goodness knows what. So a lot of it's going to be left to our institutions. It's going to be left to you folks who are working in hospitals and in data companies and high-tech companies to sort of try and do what you can. Even if sort of analytics, AI, and robots obey Isaac Asimov's rules and they don't actually go out to harm us, they or their programmers are going to have to deal with some really difficult issues. I mean, there's the famous trolley problem issue that bioethicists and philosophers can spend many an hour discussing, hopefully over a bottle or two, as to, how do you program a robot, or if you don't want to get futuristic, a Tesla, right? Do you kill the one person to avoid killing the three people? When the AI sees the crash coming and it could turn left or it could turn right. Someone is going to have to program sort of ethically. I have a podcast called The Week in Health Law, and my incredibly talented co-host is Frank Pasquale of the University of Maryland. Sometimes we have really brilliant guests on. And he, in his Black Box Society book, says it's absolutely foolish of us to believe that either the programmers or their algorithms are neutral with regard to gender, race, or class. The 2017 report, AI Now, recommended that public agencies, such as those responsible for healthcare, should not use black box AI and algorithmic systems. that more research should be done first. There should be ethical standards for programs. There should be audits of the algorithms. There is algorithmic bias, and we're going to have to figure out those pieces. A recent article in the Journal of Internal Medicine by Meyer Schoenberger and Ingwersen takes a slightly different idea, that basically saying the old idea of consents now really don't have any future in our data models and data management models, and that it's got to be regulation at the point of use. So, for example, if data is used for discriminatory purposes, then that's when you plug in the regulation. But who's going to do this, absent government? Well, they suggest, for example, that powerful institutions like universities develop data boards that are sort of mimic somewhat human subjects research boards, IRBs, institutional research boards, and they check the data and audit it. Back to the future of the professions. Susskind and Susskind again that I quoted earlier. Many years from now, high-performing, non-thinking machines will outperform the best human experts and do so in quite unhuman ways. Given this, for which tasks the professions currently perform, if any, will human beings be needed in the very long term? There are questions here that are both factual and normative. What's the future of malpractice going to look like? Is it going to be a negligence-based standard, or is it going to be products liability for bad software? And you can spin that out and out and out. For my part, I've argued that the new regulatory models and frameworks we buy into need to not only have regard for ethics, but also empathy. That we're going to lose an awful lot if we live in a world where we just deal with bright line math, and that we should be looking for empathetic solutions from our new toys. So I thought I'd finish just with sort of a question. I've been talking about data-driven healthcare technologies, but what about data-driven healthcare providers? Amazon is going to move into prescription drug sales, which triggered the Aetna-CVS merger. So they had enough market power to compete. About 9 months ago now, I wrote a piece for the Harvard blog. This was before they moved into prescription drugs, asking the question, should Amazon buy a healthcare chain, a hospital chain? Basically mimicking what they're doing with Whole Foods, but in healthcare. We know that Google is essentially reinventing data, healthcare data analysis, sometimes for good, as they do with their the care designed for low-wage poverty, areas in poverty and so on, which helps bring care there, but also the commercial healthcare platforms that they are developing. So imagine these new sort of hybrid entities, right? Maybe it's just going to be a race, and the question is, will healthcare companies become tech companies before tech companies can become healthcare companies? Or will we end up with hybrid entities that don't really look like the things that we've been regulating? And think of all of those state licensing rules that apply to hospitals and healthcare entities and how they don't apply to data companies. And think how we're going to have to sort of revisit that kind of regulation. So if you like this nonsense, I'm at Nicolas Terry on Twitter, and the podcast is The Week in Health Law at twiddle.com. Thank you very much.
And now the floor is yours. Questions, thoughts? Over there.
Do you know if there are any like ethics committees or like auditing processes already for the use of AI?
I am not, well,
in
yes,
healthcare?
there are.
Yeah.
So, Professor Francis was at a conference we put on at our place in October, and we were lucky enough that one of the panelists, I don't think you were on that panel, was the chief privacy officer for one of the big data companies. And someone asked that kind of question, what are we going to regulate this? What's going to happen? And the answer was, don't worry, trust us. We have a committee now that deals with this. Right? Now, given that these are companies and a whole area of business that is incredibly opaque, until we know how those sorts of things function, I don't think we can really consider them to be ethical boards. That's why I kind of like the idea of the university-based one, because I think we could evolve models in a transparent way in a university environment for how we think of data and how we allow data that is collected in our institutions to be used, even when it could be used without running into regulatory problems. There were two hands originally. Yes.
Yeah. Have you heard about or looked into ways to use the data that isn't like strict numbers? Like, is there any way to use physicians' notes to inform the rest of the data associated with that patient?
Well, there are data standards for reading free text sections of electronic health records so that they can actually be datafied, if you like. So the free text gets converted into something that means something along with the rest of the record. However, given that a large number of physicians ignore those free text boxes, or if they do, paste into them the thing that they wrote for the previous patient, it's probably not going to be terribly useful. Yeah.
So you talked about society kind of picking out people to become professionals. What do you see happening to those people if AI kind of takes over their fields?
Well, you could try farming.
But
Might be
AI
good
would
for
probably
you.
take that over too.
Well, I mean, it's a massive question, and I mean, there are people like McKinsey and Deloitte and everything are making a small fortune writing papers trying to predict which industries will fall first. I think one of the stats that I read, it's a McKinsey stat, is that 60% of all jobs have at least 30% of their tasks that could be fully automated. When you look at, they often do sort of bar graphs, as, who's going to be the last non-machine standing sort of thing, and it is professions that have that are built around relationships, that are about empathy, so that physicians, some other professionals, psychiatrists, neuroscientists usually come very low on the chart, which makes my wife happy. But do you have Netflix?
Yes.
You watching Altered Carbon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You're a sleeve, right?
Where are lawyers on that? Oh, sorry. Where are lawyers on that list?
Oh, we'll be long gone. It's interesting. I mean, there is so much hubris. I mean, there are data companies that's who are now rebranding what they used to be in law firms as, where we used to call them expert systems, right? Which essentially are, they bring up templates built in Word, but with some legal language, and you can create a property conveyance or a lease or something like that. And they're sort of rebranding themselves as, AI for law sort of thing, and we're really smart, and they're about as smart as a Roomba, right? I mean, which is only really good for frightening your cat. So it is inevitable, I think. You will see fewer shareholder professionals, and you will see more paraprofessionals, and slowly those paraprofessionals will be replaced by more machines. And then, so I would definitely, if you could just develop some basic farming skills, or you just float in the big water bath.
And you had mentioned that our generation's flying car is precision medicine. Did you mean that in a diagnostic standpoint or the prescriptive like you had mentioned?
No, it's just simply, I've been waiting all my life for a flying car, right? I was promised a flying car 40 years ago. I've never had a flying car. And I feel that way about personalized medicine. When we crack the genome and everyone goes, well, you'll be all right. We'll have this magic bullet that will cure whatever ails you. And we're just not going to see that for a long time. So no, it was mere skepticism.
Gotcha.
You were talking earlier about how Amazon branching into prescription drug sales. So with that, do you mean pharmacists? I mean, that job in general could be seen as getting something that gets
right?
phased out. And what about the?
All right. Well, first of all, Amazon does not branch out into things. Right? Amazon's basic business model is that they want to take a percentage of every single transaction that takes place in the world. And they do that essentially by building systems and products that they can sell to others, but they also sell to themselves. Amazon is, for example, its own best customer in a lot of ways. So, for example, Amazon built the Amazon cloud to support its own transactions. But it is now the largest seller of cloud services, right? So it produces a product, and it's also its own best consumer. Why did they buy Whole Foods?
To deliver groceries.
Because the most expensive part of Amazon's business is what's called the last mile, or the last 2 miles, right? They have their own aircraft, their own shipping companies. They have their own shipping company now. They're building a fleet of planes, and they're now beginning to brand their own trucks. So don't invest in UPS or FedEx, right? But the last mile or so to get it to your home is extremely expensive, and that's why sometimes you will see, if you live in a residential area, you'll be surprised to see the US Post Office delivering on a Sunday. Well, what they do is they buy Sunday time from the US Post Office because the trucks are available, and so they use them as a cheap delivery model. You'll see Uber drivers delivering packages. Well, another model is if we had a distribution center that was very, very close, within 1 mile to 2 miles, of affluent neighborhoods. Ooh, that would be a Whole Foods, right? So we can use that as a distribution center. People could actually pick things up while they're shopping, because it'll be cheaper to shop there. Or there'll be delivery services going to and from those things. Whole Foods have lots of spare space, right? It's really going to be easy to kick out the sort of the fluffy bunny part of the thing that they sell nonsense, awful things that no one really cares about but look arty, right? You get rid of that corner of the store and you put a pharmacy in there, right? And then you're going to have licensed pharmacists in all of your distribution centers, and they're going to be licensed in every state. So that's the kind of model of expansion. Now, to go back to my first point, the rather obscure one, they're going to be their own best customer. So they're going into a deal with Berkshire Hathaway and, well, the third one I don't care. So
Chase.
yeah, Chase, right? And everyone's going, well, you know what? They're just going to use their bargaining power to get better prices on things. That's not how Amazon works. Amazon builds a product for its own use and also sells it. It gets double value out of everything it builds. So they're going to build a healthcare system for their own employees. Just like I think Walmart will end up doing. But because they're Amazon, once they've built it for their own use, they will also sell it to others. And so I think it is for real. I think they are actually going to do healthcare. And they will have pharmacists for a while, but they'll be replaced by drones.
Okay. I have to
I
tell my
mean-
mom that.
Right? I mean, the illegal drug distributors are already using drones. Fentanyl is being distributed by using drones in this country. That'd be a better use for AR-15s. Shoot them down. Yes.
When you're talking about all like the Apple Health data and stuff like that, do you think all these new features are going to actually be harmful, or do you think they'll be helpful? Like with all this health data that people don't understand, like at their fingertips. We had another speaker talk about like disclosing research studies and people not understanding what stuff means and how that could impact them. What do you think about that?
Well, let's parse it out a little bit. I mean, when we think about that industry at the moment, we're probably talking about the wellness industry. All right? So you have a Fitbit. Your employer has a deal with Fitbits. You get discounts if you do gym things, if your BMI goes certain ways. And there are various very tricky laws that apply to those things. The ADA regs, GINA regs, all of the EEOC stuff that also impacts HIPAA. There is no real evidence that any of that stuff does anything useful. The only people who are really profiting from the wellness craze are wellness companies who found that they have a multi-billion-dollar business that they can sell to employers who think this may be the magic bullet that will reduce their healthcare. Most of the studies are beginning to show a decline in that kind of wellness business. So let's take them off the table as just sort of junk, and hopefully they'll go away, and the workplace health discrimination that goes with those programs will also go. And so let's look at the George. You're permanently connected, right?
I am.
With your Apple Watch. We can monitor your health. Is it going to make us? What is our health problem in this country? There's relatively, if you are, unless you're very, very poor, your health is not really your medical health, your healthcare is not really your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is social determinants. It's your environment. And it's things like that that are the greatest threats. Are these kind of gadgets and monitoring our blood flow and stuff like that going to really get cut deeply into that kind of issue? If you look not at health, but at healthcare delivery and the problems that we have in this country with healthcare, are these going to change that? Is this going to be the democratization of healthcare and the grand lowering of costs because we're our own data curators and we're going to sort of cure ourselves by immediately, my watch tells my car that I'm about to have a heart attack, right? And so we will see this within the next 2 or 3 years. That when that happens, my car, my electric car, my Tesla, will carefully pull over to the side of the road, put on the flashing lights, and call EMS. Probably also call my wife and say I'm going to be late for dinner. Maybe very late. So yeah, that might be some harm reduction that we could see, but it's not going to cure our fragmented healthcare system, is it? I mean, the fact that I can collect all my EHR, is that going to stop fragmentation? Is that going to improve coordination? A little bit, maybe. Because instead of me relying on Dr. A to hand off to Dr. B, maybe when I go to Dr. B, they just get a dump of my watch data, and I don't have to rely on whether or not you sent that data on, whether it was interoperable, because I've got it. So maybe some improvements there.
Well, isn't one worry that it's being faced by just collecting so much data is just information overload, mixing of signals? Like, one of the best examples was about a year ago, a joke article was going around how a person wore their Fitbit during sex, and the actual signals and heart signals in it resembled a heart attack. So what happens when you have all this programming in there and then something similar happens, or events that produce the same results get mixed up?
Well, I mean, I think the downside of what happened, I mean, I think does prove the adage that people with Fitbits have less sex, and I think that's good. Although if you look, most Fitbits are actually in drawers. Go home and see how many Fitbits you've got in your drawer. Well, I mean, to an extent, you're inviting my topic, aren't you? Because humans can't deal with that amount of data. So we either constrict the data flow or find a way of making the data more relevant. We turn data into information that humans can understand, or we give up on that process and say, let the machines do it. Because the machines will be able to handle it. The question is, who will tell them what information we want and what action we want, right? It's data, information, action are the 3 stages. Who makes the decisions as to what information we want and what action we want? Right? So if the data is showing that out of 100 people that we're currently monitoring nearby, you know, if you could imagine when you go on Lyft or Uber and you see the little cars, like little ants that are near you, right? If you imagine that we were doing sort of data scrutiny of sort of the environment and we had 100 people or something, and we saw signals that would suggest maybe 10 are in some kind of health peril. Are we going to be able to save all 10? Or does the algorithm say, well, don't bother with the poor people, because even if we save them this time, it'll just happen to them again? Who's going to stop that happening? Who's going to say that that information and that action is wrong? That, I think, is the modern data overflow problem. And maybe we won't be in the equation, and the Fitbits will be having sex with each other. You really are going to top that, are you? Okay.
Thinking about the ethics of that, what do you anticipate as more likely, that the statutory regime will get out ahead of this, or that it's going to be a matter of litigation that will eventually force Congress's hand if one could force Congress to do anything these days, right? To tell you where I am on what I think is more likely to happen. But so where do you think any of this goes, or do you think it's just going to be the Wild West?
All right, so I think so far we've had one Tesla death, right? Supposing over the next 2 or 3 years we have 1,000 deaths emanating from autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicles, you could see sort of panic legislation saying, stop, right? No more autonomous cars. We don't care that the future of the industry is on that. We don't care that maybe overall road safety will be improved if we don't have idiots driving, that we have computers driving. So you could have like a sort of a dramatic panic response. And you see that in other areas that bioethicists look at. So, you know, designer babies. When you first start seeing you know, sheep cloning and stuff like that, the newspaper headlines blare, you know, human clones on street next year, right? Well, if they were, maybe there'd be legislation stopping that. But would that really do much? Because they'll go to China or they'll go to Mexico to do it, which we saw with CRISPR-Cas9. Right, when we started doing when we saw gene editing, National Institutes of Health said, not on our dime we won't, right? And so there was just arbitrage, regulatory arbitrage. It was shipped abroad, and they did it, and now the NIH is going, oh, actually it's quite a good idea, isn't it? As soon as George tells us how to fix the intellectual property issues. So you can see those sort of very highly reactive pieces of legislation. Absent those kinds of sort of horror stories, you know, the 1,000 Tesla deaths kind of thing, we will see, and I join your cynicism, we will see little nibbling around the edges, right? You know, we'll see no AI if it can impact abortions, right? We'll have a strong rule saying that AI cannot be used in abortions, right?
You should make that bet right now, actually, that that's going to be the first law Congress passes related
Right?
to AI.
And so you'll get sort of the wacky sign that go. I mean, depending on your belief structure, kind of like sort of wacky kind of things like that. So just nibbling, but generally apart from that, everyone will go on and say, well, let's see how it plays out. So those are the two sorts of scenarios I think I see. So if there was a big thing, right? If there was a thalidomide, we'd change the Food and Drug Act, and we'd put in a whole lot more regulation. If our robot overlords get really ugly. There's a great YouTube, I forget who put it out. Google dog robots. So some company is designing dog robots. You'll know you get the right one. They're yellow with sort of black trim. They look like robots, not dogs. You'll find them quickly. And so a dog is trying to get through a door. A robot dog is trying to get through a door, and it doesn't have a push. It has a pull handle. Vertical handle, and it can't do it. It can't open it. So it whistles for its partner dog, which has a grapple, and it teaches it its problem. And it comes over. Its friend comes over and opens the door, and the two of them run through. Now I have a dumb dog and a very smart dog. And I immediately named these two robot dogs after mine. But if the robot dogs come after us, you had a question. I was tailing off into silliness.
No, to that point, kind of, you were mentioning how objective can this AI and this technology be? I'm thinking gun research, gun violence research, and there's different universities.
We don't have gun violence.
But
We have a mental health problem.
There's different.
Read the paper.
Where there's different universities, collecting data at the moment on that. But I see kind of how you can politicize like if something comes out saying, well, this model, this algorithm tells us this is the policies that we should follow versus another one. Is that a possibility, or is it more evidence-based and more?
Yeah, well, algorithmic lawmaking is certainly, policy making is certainly interesting. I'll give you a couple of examples of sort of danger areas. Do you have red light cameras in Utah? You get a ticket if you run the red light. Okay. Lots of states have red light. Cities have red light cameras.
Legislature slammed them a few years ago.
And although they are government entity, can appear to be, they're all run by private companies. And they program in what kind of allowance they'll give you. Did you still have a little bit of yellow, right? Or how far across the intersection before we'll say you violated the red camera. And so you can change that. The criterion for that is revenue. So these red light camera companies guarantee a certain amount of revenue to the municipalities. And they will therefore adjust how much leeway you get to fit a revenue model. And yet we think of criminal law, and a red light citation is criminal law. We think of that as being objective and sort of morally grounded in some way, or socially grounded, and yet that's being adjusted. How do you feel about algorithmic-based sentencing? Because we're seeing that private companies getting into that kind of stuff.
I'll give you an example that was just last week in pediatrics. There was a discussion of whether predictive models of who is likely to be a victim of child abuse are discriminatory. And that this was a small study in, I think it was New Zealand, but a really interesting piece of it was that the false positives, that is where there was a prediction and the kid turned out not to have been an abuse victim, were mostly cases in which the kid actually was injured in some way. So the model was super good at predicting risk to the kids, even if it wasn't as good at predicting abuse. So it wasn't highly specific on abuse, but it was highly specific on risk. So what do you do with that? I mean, maybe what was going on, for example, is part of what it did was predict that poor people are more likely to abuse their kids, and poor kids are also more likely to live in neighborhoods where they get shot or drive in cars where their families haven't had the money to fix the brakes, or whatever it was that was going on. But in the healthcare area, people are looking really seriously at the question of whether predictive models for child abuse.
Right, and with most things, the legal system, right, is error-strewn, right? And we know that from the first year. We know that the legal system makes mistakes. But what we try and design laws or processes where depending on which way you're going, where the number of false positives is the number of false negatives is so outweighed by the number of false positives or something like that. So we design a system that sort of works for us, but we accept that it has an error rate. I think the whole question of data. I mean, if you leave aside the musings of my friend the Black Box Society co-author, let's say that we put the algorithmic bias to a side for a moment. Let's say we just buy into it. Data analysis, algorithmic analysis is let's say is highly accurate and doesn't have huge downsides. Well, that's going to create, if I may borrow someone's movie title or book title, something of an inconvenient truth in places, isn't it? I mean, if there's one thing that we know from the last year, it is that evidence-based decision-making is being deprecated. And the data that is necessary for evidence-based decision-making is being hidden, or its generation is being prohibited. Where are we if we do not have our science? We do not have our data. So that's another interesting sort of political question. The extent to which these kinds of smart machines may actually be inconvenient. Does that explain some of the anti-Silicon Valley sentiments that have been expressed? Or are those sentiments well taken because we've allowed the Googles and the Facebooks and everyone to collect all this data and change the world that we live in without really giving us a say in it?
Maybe that's a great place on which to stop and bring in the refreshments.
A dystopian meme.
Thank you. Please stick around, and there will be